And we're going live. So, as I mentioned before at the very outset, we are going to have a few more things to say about Descartes, but a lot of this lecture is going to just cover some some of the other modern philosophers and modern philosophy in general, mainly or namely the debate between the rationalists and the empiricists. And we've basically, I guess you could say, have been getting an unfair showing by the rationalists because we've been focusing on Descartes. So towards the end of the lecture, we'll probably spend, I would say, an unfair amount of time on the empiricist versus the rationalist. But I don't want to skip. There's a couple names I mentioned. I think I mentioned at the end of the last video, Spinoza and Leibniz, who are rationalists. We'll talk a little bit about them, but then we'll go on to the empiricists. Remember, just to remind ourselves, what is the distinction between rationalism and empiricism? What is this debate that's going on in the modern period, the early modern period of philosophy? We're talking, the 1600s, 1700s, all the way up until, I guess, the early 1800s. Then you're talking late modern at that point. What was the debate? Well, the rationalists, remember, and Descartes is one of them, they are very insistent that knowledge is based on reason and understanding. So it's an epistemology. These are competing epistemologies, theories of knowledge. And the rationalists want to say that our knowledge is always based on not our perceptions, not our senses, not our imagination either, although that would be a part of our mind. It's this faculty of reason and understanding. So Descartes represents that camp. The empiricists, on the other hand, are going to say, no, knowledge always begins with experience. John Locke famously, he claims that our mind is a blank slate when we're born. Unlike someone like Descartes, who says that there's something intrinsic about certain concepts. We just know directly what our thoughts, what thinking is. We just intrinsically know what a thing is, and it's just innate. It's just an innate understanding. The empiricists tend to think that no, there's no ideas or concepts that aren't already, that weren't previously in some experience. So that's the basic distinction between the two camps. And we'll go through a few examples of some of these thinkers. I've got this picture up. We've been looking at how do I square my experience, this little thought bubble up here, with the world out there. And we're going to look at some of the different approaches from these different camps, right? How does each epistemology, how does each theory of knowledge deal with this conundrum? But as I also mentioned before I hit the record button at the very outset, we're going to talk a bit about Descartes and his, and this is at the end of our actual reading in the Meditations, Meditation 6, we're finally wrapping up. We're going to talk about his distinction between the mind and the body and how these two interact with each other. We won't spend too much time on it. It'll be brief, but it's worth mentioning because it's something that's still pretty controversial today. And if you ever take a class, I know at U of H in their philosophy department, this is, heck, I don't know what to age myself, but 10 years ago when I was in grad school, when you took philosophy of mind, they would cover this stuff. They would cover Descartes. And his view of mind and body is not, most philosophers of mind, as far as at least 10 years ago, this was the case. They did not subscribe to his view. They found it very problematic. But this reading is a good place to sort of point out the problem that is now known in the literature, known in philosophy as the mind-body problem. So we'll talk a little bit about the mind-body problem. And then, again, moving on to other philosophers within the early modern period, these early modern Enlightenment thinkers, people like Leibniz and Spinoza and John Locke and so on. So one quick note about Descartes before we get into the whole mind-body thing. Even though the focus that I've been looking at, what I've been focusing on and what I've argued that they're focusing on in this period more than anything else is epistemology, theory of knowledge. But that doesn't mean that Descartes wasn't doing metaphysics. We saw that plainly with his concerns about providing proofs for God's existence. He had to dabble in metaphysics to some extent in order to get his epistemology off the ground. So he thought that, you know, I guess when he talks about first philosophy in the title of the work that we read, Meditations on First Philosophy, he still thinks that, yeah, the first philosophy is getting knowledge straight. It's epistemology, having a good, clear definition of what it means to know, a high standard for knowledge, what counts as knowledge, and also coupled that with some methodology for acquiring knowledge once we know what the criteria for that is. That's still number one, but like I said, it's not that he completely ignores any sort of dabbling in metaphysics. Descartes constructs, and it's not super apparent here in the reading we did, but he constructs what you might call a dualistic metaphysics. Descartes argues for a dualism, a form of a metaphysical dualism. You know, I don't know if I've ever used that term in this class before, dualism, but it can mean different things in different contexts. Now, in this case, this is probably the more common use of the term of the word dualism, but you might, I would say, with good justification, you could label Plato. You know, he's a dualist in a sense. His metaphysics, remember, is based on the idea of forms. There are these immaterial forms. They're perfect, eternal, unchanging, and they are outside of the realm that we're in right now. They're outside of time and space. Remember, for Plato, there's this higher realm of perfection that is the cause of this lower realm that is kind of a shadow, a changing, fleeting shadow of that higher realm. So there's this sort of metaphysical dualism between two worlds for Plato. There's the higher world of forms and the lower visible realm that we have access to through our senses, the physical world, the material world, however you want to label it. But for Descartes, his dualism is a little different. It's not that there are two separate, realms, like with Plato's forms, but instead there's one world, there's one universe that is composed of two types of substances. So you can classify matter or substance or stuff into two categories. There's what he would label extended substance, and this is what you and I probably have in mind when we hear of the word substance. Something is a substance of some kind, or it has mass or material. Extended in this context means taking up space, having dimensions, being extended in that sense. So there are things that take up space, and there are things that don't, the unextended substances. And those are sort of like, what could he mean by that? What exists that doesn't take up space? Sometimes I have students, is he talking about air, oxygen? But no, oxygen actually does take up space, right? It doesn't have as much density as other matter, right? But literally, it does take up space. But he's talking about, as far as I can tell, the only thing that we know of, that we have access to that's unextended, are our thoughts, our mind, what you might call the soul, or the self. Descartes doesn't seem to distinguish between those terms, soul, mind, self. As far as I can tell, he uses them interchangeably. There are other philosophers who do not do that. They think of these as distinct concepts and distinct things. But this brings us to the mind-body problem, which I was mentioning earlier, which we should probably cover because it's still, like I said, controversial today. And the mind-body problem is a problem that comes up if you are like Descartes and you insist on this strict dualism where the mind is a completely immaterial thing. And you have to explain then, he tries to do this briefly in Meditation 6. It's kind of convoluted, right? He uses this sort of analogy of these balls that are like connected to each other. And he talks about the soul as this unextended substance that doesn't take up any space whatsoever and that is completely immaterial, and yet it is in our body, or it's attached to our body somehow, and it controls our body somehow. This is the mystery he doesn't really ever explain. Well, he does, and I'll tell you how he does it in a minute here, but it's, by most of the readers of Descartes, not the most satisfactory explanation. But the problem again is, how do these two forces interact? Descartes thinks again that the mind controls the body. He knows that there's communication both ways. He doesn't think, well, obviously, if I feel pain in my body, that affects my mind. But my mind is what controls my body and tells my body to, hey, you're thirsty, grab that bottle of water, take a sip before you proceed and keep talking and talking. But ultimately, the mind is the master of the body and controls it, etc., etc. The problem then is, how is it that something that is completely non-physical, the mind, if it is non-physical, how does it control and move around something that is physical, the body? And Descartes never really resolved this in his earlier writings, and one of his friends, Princess Elizabeth, famously wrote him a letter expressing her confusion about this problem. She asked him, how is it that the mind controls the body? And he gave her a very condescending reply, the first letter, but she persisted. He said something like, you're overthinking things, it just does. Basically a very question-begging reply. It just does. And she actually agreed. She says, it does. I do think the mind controls the body because I have this sort of direct experience of it. I feel my mind and my thoughts having this control over my body. Sometimes my body influences my thoughts, and my thoughts sort of give in to my body, she said. But she's not asking if the mind controls the body. She's asking how, by what mechanism? And she starts to cite some of the physics that was current at the time. And it was pretty primitive physics, but some of it was kind of similar to the way we think of physics today. She said, when something is moved, in other words, the body being moved, if it's a physical thing, like the body's a physical thing, it's being moved by something that is also physical, that either has mass or force, some sort of energy, right? All those concepts at the time, and still kind of do, entail each other. So how is it something that has no mass, no physical force, move something that is physical? And Descartes was sort of like, it just, in some of his later writings, which I've never read, but I've read about his reply, but in several sources, so I'm pretty sure they're not lying. Apparently, his solution in, I think, the Principles of Philosophy, I think is where you'll find this, which he dedicates, I believe, to Princess Elizabeth. He explains that the mind is located, even though it doesn't have any spatial temporal properties, it's located somewhere. The mind is located in the pineal gland, which I believe here's the base of our skull or something, where our spine is, close to the spine. And he said that the mind moves the body by turning itself into a half extended, half unextended sort of middle substance, a vapor, and moves the body around. That was his solution. Doesn't sound like it's something he's basing on evidence that is certain and necessary and indubitable. All these things that he says he has to, I won't accept anything as true unless it's, how is he absolutely certain that this is how the mind moves the body? Today we tend to sort of laugh at this dualism in philosophy and in the scientific community. You know, if you're a neuroscientist, we tend to think of the mind as just a part of our body, as a physical process. We have these neurons in our brains, these electrical um, signals that fire off whenever our senses are stimulated. We're stimulated by outside external stimuli, and it fires off these electrical currents in our brain, you know. And when we see certain things more than once, or certain patterns emerge, we create these connections between those electrical, you know, I'm really bad at explaining this because I'm not a scientist, right? But these signals in our brain create these connections called synapses, you know, and the mind is just a collection of all these connections that we've made. And yes, and someone's asking in the comments, is he saying the mind is non-physical? Yes, he is. He's saying, and this is something he insists, and he thinks he proved it pretty much. I doubt this. He thinks he proves it at the beginning because he says, I don't need my body to exist. My body could be an illusion, but my mind couldn't. I could never doubt my mind, even if the evil genius was tricking me. So the mind is something that it doesn't depend on a body, doesn't depend on anything physical, and so it's a non-physical thing. Yeah.
Excuse me, Professor, I'm Lola.
Yes.
Why would he say that? I was the one who put the comment about that. I believe he's saying that the mind is non-physical. Why?
That was a very common view. I mean, that was what Plato thought. A lot of these philosophers thought that. They thought of the mind as non-physical, and I'm going to try to come to help him out here, because most people have your attitude, like, how can he think the mind's non-physical? I think we grew up in a society where we understand the mind is connected to the brain, and we understand how the mind works. Not completely. It's still there's a lot to be done. Neuroscience has a lot to uncover, but I think we take it for granted, all this stuff. But and I think some of this, you know, for Plato, maybe not so much, but some of these other philosophers, this might be rooted in religion and their religious beliefs in a soul. And so the idea is that when our physical substance in our body decays, which it is going to, our body is always changing. It's always in a process of getting older and aging. So someday it's going to expire. But this thought, the mind inside of us, is the same mind that we had as a child. It's the same soul. It's the same self. It's the one identity that we have. And so, you know, Plato, through the words of Socrates in the Phaedo, argues that this is one reason that we should think of the soul as immortal, that it can live on beyond the physical life, and that it has access to ideas and thoughts which are non-physical. And Aristotle was the more popular reading of Aristotle, that he disagreed with Plato. I kind of think that he was on the fence. I think Aristotle tended to be more with us, the modern view that the mind is a physical thing. It's a process of some sort. I mean, he didn't know about neurons and things like that, but he was very skeptical of the prospect that the mind could exist without the body, or vice versa. That the mind, he said, if a body doesn't have a mind, it's just a corpse. You know, they kind of need each other, right? Without one, you know, there's this sort of symbiotic relation. There are some reading of some reading of Aristotle, though, where he seems to hint, if you read De Anima a certain way, he seems to hint that there might be one aspect of our soul he calls the nous, which is understanding, that is something that doesn't depend on physical. It's sort of detached from the physical. And if there is any part of us that could sustain itself, it would be this aspect of our soul, that noetic, the nous, you know, this mysterious, N-O-U-S is the Greek word. But I think, though, too, there's a contemporary philosopher. I might be miscrediting this stance, but I'm pretty sure it's Chalmers. There's a guy named Chalmers, British guy, who does philosophy of mind, and I think he's the one. It might be not Chalmers, but not Church. It's definitely not Churchland. Anyways, I hope it's Chalmers, and I hope I'm not misattributing this distinction. But he talks about the easy problem of the mind versus the difficult problem of the mind. And he would say that the easy problem of the mind is actually not that easy, but we know how to fix, we know how to solve it. And the easy question of the mind is, well, how does the mind work? What creates the mind and all that? And that's what neuroscientists and biologists and other scientists can actually study. They can look at brain scans. They can look at the physical brain. So he says, Chalmers, I think it is, that says this. That's the easy question of the mind. The difficult question of the mind is, what is the mind? What is thought? What is consciousness? Everything we ever experience is on the basis of consciousness. We're human beings. We think. We experience the world through our conscious thought. What are thoughts? And where does it really originate besides just the physical explanation of it? How does it, what causes it in the universe? What's the difference between like an animal? You said, in your comments, no intelligence. If there's no mind and no body together, I guess maybe that's why you're saying that. But yeah, don't animals have a certain amount of intelligence? And there are some people who think that even computers, depending on what they can think, are intelligent. What is a mind? What is thought? This is debatable. You've got people developing artificial intelligence, and other philosophers say you can't develop artificial intelligence. You can create a computer that mimics intelligent beings and tricks you into thinking that they have a mind, but you can't create a mind. It's the sort of more philosophical, spiritual, religious question, I suppose. And this is where Descartes, I think he's sticking with that. He's like, the mind is something that is non-physical and it moves the body somehow. That he comes up with this crazy hypothesis. But this is a difficult question, and if you're super interested in it, take a class in philosophy of mind. Maybe you can talk your psychology. If you're a psychology major, you can maybe talk your the dean of the psychology department to let you take a class at UH philosophy and take philosophy of mind. It gets super technical though. I gotta warn you. They kind of start with this basic Descartes stuff, and they get real, into cognitive science and all that stuff. So it's not an easy class. But anyway, let's look at. I want to talk a little bit about a couple other philosophers that were rationalists, and then let's look at some of the empiricists. I don't know if we're gonna have time for this because we're already like halfway through the lecture. But I want to eventually get to Kant. I don't know if you can see it there at the bottom, very bottom of my slide. I've got the name Kant in all caps with 3 question marks. I put the question marks there originally for a different reason, but I guess we can interpret them as, I don't know if I'll get to him today in this context. I put the question marks there originally because he doesn't really quite fit into either one of these 2 camps. He's neither a rationalist nor an empiricist. But I don't think you guys can see my chat box, but I'm moving it anyways because it might be in the way of one of these words. Next to the names Leibniz and Spinoza on the left, you see the term natural religion. Now, Descartes, although he was a man of faith, if you read the opening lines or the introduction of to the Meditations, not the first paragraph, but if you read, there's like a little opening synopsis. He claims that he's writing this essay almost in defense of the church, but what he thinks needs to happen is that all these more scientifically minded individuals, these natural philosophers, what we would now call scientists, back then they called them natural philosophers of nature, they need to sort of separate themselves from the theological problems. So the problems about God and salvation and the afterlife. That Descartes thought that ethics and values, that was the job of the church, and that philosophy needed to part ways with religion, so science and philosophy could do their own thing, and that the church could do its thing, and that they wouldn't compete, but they would actually complement one another. So that was sort of his thing. Let's split and sort of you work on that part, we'll work on this part, and we'll make some progress. Now, when we get to thinkers like Leibniz and Spinoza, they refused to do this. Even though they were rationalists, they didn't really quite buy into this with Descartes. They actually they didn't want to separate their theological concerns from their scientific concerns, and so they were practicing what was later called natural religion. I don't think this is a term that either one of them coined, but by the time critics like David Hume come around, late 1700s, that's what people were calling it, and it was very popular. So when David Hume, hopefully we'll get to him at least a little bit today, when he comes out in the late 1700s and he publishes his essays attacking natural religion, it doesn't really work out well for him. He gets a lot of pushback, and it kind of destroys his career. He was never really taken seriously as a philosopher until quite a while after he's gone. Unfortunately, that's the case about a lot of people in history. They're a little bit ahead of their time, and their influence doesn't show up until much later on. And I think if you told David Hume on his deathbed that he would be one of the most important philosophers, if not the most important philosopher, at least who was writing in the English language, that would probably be pretty. He's definitely one of the top 2 or 3 who was writing in English in history. He would have laughed. He might have thought, I think I deserve it because I feel like I had something really relevant to say. But yeah, I don't think it's going to happen. It really wasn't until Kant read David Hume, and it made Kant rethink his rationalism and sort of come up with a new sort of middle ground position. But let's talk a little bit. I don't want to spend too much time on Leibniz and Spinoza, but again, they were both rationalists, but they were also very religious and wanted. Descartes was religious. He went to church, but he thought you could split up science and faith, and split up your science and your religion, and that was fine. But Leibniz and Spinoza, we want to incorporate. We want to use philosophy and use science to actually support and provide evidence for our religious views and for our theological positions. And Hume hated that. Hume was like, you can't do that. You can't really prove. I mean, Leibniz was a genius. I don't want to sell him short. Leibniz was, he was one of the first thinkers to develop calculus. There's a debate whether it was him or Newton who did that first, but they were doing it around the same time. He invented a calculator, but then he also made arguments about whether or not certain of the sacraments would be effective on the moon. The church sacraments, like the y'all probably know what communion is. Even if you're not Catholic, you probably have heard of communion. You go and you have to eat the wafer and drink the blood, eat the flesh and drink the blood of Christ, So he apparently, I never read this essay, but apparently Leibniz wrote an essay. He was arguing, is it possible to do communion on the moon? Like, let's imagine there were people up there. They didn't know. You got to cut him some slack, right? He's writing in the 1600s, so we don't know. Maybe people live on the moon, okay? We haven't got there yet, okay? So let's just assume there are people on the moon. He's wondering, well, if they have a church up there and they do communion, would it be effective? And apparently he argued that no, communion, or actually transubstantiation, making the bread into the body of Christ and making the wine into the blood of Christ, that would not be effective on the moon, because his reasoning for this was that Christ died for the sins of the earth, not the sins of the moon. And so you'll see later philosophers like David Hume just scoff. You can't prove whether or not this is effective on the moon or even on Earth. This is metaphysics. You'll see, and I don't know if we'll have time to get deep into it, but when we get to Hume, he is very much opposed to most of what we call metaphysics. And I think that this makes the focus on epistemology, theory of knowledge, even greater. You can argue that most Western philosophy after Hume, even philosophers who proclaim to be religious in their personal lives, they don't want to mess with metaphysics and questions about proofs for God or this or that and all that. But up until the late 1700s, this was, very popular because of Leibniz and to a lesser extent, Spinoza. So I have the term atomism next to Leibniz's name. I know Leibniz would not like that because he was opposed to atomism. Atomism, the belief that everything can be broken down into these physical atoms, the smallest particle possible. But his view was somewhat like atomism. He thought that there weren't like physical building blocks of reality, but there were these substantive or formal building blocks of reality, that all of reality was composed of what he called these monads, these individual forms that couldn't be separated or broken down into anything more essential. And the whole universe was an organization of all these monads, these little particles. I hate to call them particles because, again, he's like, they're not physical. They're like little souls. Every substance, every animal or human is a monad, but that's not our physical substance. It's not our body. It's like this force within us. It's this driving force, this monadic thing. I don't know what else to describe it, but the whole universe is composed of these things. These are what the thing in itself is. Remember that old problem we've been dealing with? We kind of saw Descartes' solution, but remember that old problem we were dealing with? We've got this world out there. There's this object, I'm assuming. Maybe there isn't even a world out there. For all I know, it could be just all in my head. That's kind of absurd, but who knows? Maybe that's what things are. Descartes says, well, you can't trust your senses. I've got this idea of the sun that I have from my experience and from my senses, and that makes the sun feel like it's a lot closer and look like it's a lot smaller than it really is. But my reason tells me that the sun is much further away and much larger than it really appears. So we have to sort of not go with sort of our experience, but with our reasoning. And that's how we get to the object out there, the thing in itself. Well, Leibniz thought that really ultimately, once we kept pushing our reason further and further and abstracting and pulling away as much from the senses as possible, we got closer and closer to the monads and an explanation of all these individual substances. That was the thing in itself. That's what's really real. Everything else is just appearance and perspective. But since Leibniz was a very religious thinker, he believed that all these monads, they're pre-programmed, all their activities issue forth from their nature. They do what they were planned to do, and the universe, as it's organized, all these sort of structures and individual things that the structures are made of, it all works out to be the best of all possible worlds, he claims, he argues. Why would he say that we live in the best of all possible worlds? And it seems like we could make the world better. Like, couldn't the world be better if there were less hungry people and less disease, less death? Wouldn't it be a better world if, like, we didn't have to wear masks still and, like, this was over with? We didn't have to go on Zoom meetings? Why would he say it's the best of all possible worlds? Anybody have any idea his argument? No one's got any thoughts, perhaps? Well, think about it. He believes that the world was created by a divine, perfect being. And so he believes that if God, that's what he refers to the divine being as, if God created the world, and God can do anything, he could have made the world otherwise. He could have made the universe otherwise, but he didn't. So there must have been a good reason for that. God must have designed the world the best way it could possibly be. And so for Leibniz, there really is no evil or bad in the world. There's just a perception of it. If we could see everything, if we could see that it all worked out, it was all great and divine and perfect. There's a famous French writer, satirist, humorist named Voltaire. I've had some students tell me that they had to read him in high school. That's kind of cool. I wish I got to read Voltaire in high school. He's kind of funny, but Voltaire makes fun of this statement that we live in the best of all possible worlds, famously in his novel Candide. In Candide, maybe I should type that out here in case anyone's curious. Yeah, Voltaire is the name of the writer. And the novel, it's a novella, so I guess I can put it in quotation marks, is Candide. And it's basically like it's funny because it's tragic, if that makes any sense. It's like absurdly tragic. The main character, Candide, he starts out as an orphan, and it just gets worse from there. He gets kicked out of his foster home, or whatever. The caretaker kicks him out on the streets. He ends up hanging out with some con artist, and he's a very good-spirited, good-natured boy, though. And when he was a young kid, his teacher taught him about Leibniz and how he lived in the best of all possible worlds. And so as he's going through all these like ridiculously tragic things, I mean, they get like ridiculous. You're like, what? It can't get worse. And it's got like this sort of like happy ending, but it's not really happy. It's like, but he's still content. It's hard to explain, but it works. Throughout the novel, though, he keeps telling himself, even as all this horror and death, and he lives through this earthquake that decimates Lisbon in Portugal. He keeps telling himself, well, it's the best of all possible worlds. I can't complain. If God could have made it better, he would have, right? But the idea is that, I hate to use this analogy because Leibniz would never use it. There were no computers back then, but it's almost like the universe. God is the ultimate computer programmer, and everything is working itself out it's like algorithmically into the best possible configuration imaginable. And so that's sort of the justification for his claim. Now, Spinoza, man, we're getting close to the end here, so I don't want to spend too much time on Spinoza. We need to give a little bit of airtime to these empiricists. But Spinoza is a very interesting thinker. He, oh, that was a mistake. Let me back that up. He opts for not this kind of atomistic collection of individual substances or monads, but instead he claims that the entire universe is one giant substance. So he's what you would call a monist. He holds a philosophical position known as monism. And monism is not super common in the history of philosophy, but it's not unprecedented. It's actually, I think now, if you look at more modern thinkers, it's starting to gain more footing. But it goes back far to the Greeks. You had people like Parmenides, who thought that everything was one, and not only that, but it wasn't even changing, and that change was illusory. And even though we think that we're separate from the world around us, we're all just one big blob of stuff, right? The thing about Spinoza, one of the things, he's really an interesting philosopher. I honestly think that perhaps Leibniz is a stronger philosopher as far as his arguments are concerned, but Spinoza is by far more interesting as far as being just being interesting. But one of the more interesting things about him and his monism, particularly, is that, well, everything is all one. Okay, so even though I think I'm different from my desk, and I think I'm different from all of you guys, and I think I'm different from the air that I'm breathing, it's really just an illusion, and we're all part of this one thing, this one substance. But I think the novelty and the interesting part about his monism is the fact that he's also a deist. He's also believes that there's a divine being that is responsible for all that is. So if you put two and two together, if everything is all one and God exists, then what is everything? Anybody got a clue where he's going with this? What is this divine? What is this big substance that we all are? What would we call it? Capital God. So we're all God. Not that we're God, we're all parts of Him. Everything in the universe, all that is, all that has existence, is God. This is also pantheism, is a term for this theological position that the universe itself is the embodiment or is God embodied. Certain interpretations of Hinduism, certain sects and understandings of Hinduism are like this. From my understanding, though, it's not the physical universe that we see is only like 20%, or I think they have a very precise, let's say it's only 28.5% of all existence. The rest is stuff we can't even see, but it's all God. It's all one big deity. And so, and also for Spinoza, evil and bad things are just an absence or a hole or a void, a lack of being, a lack of anything. And we talked about the problem of evil earlier, so I won't dwell on that too much. All right, well, let's get to the empiricist. I don't have too much time left, so I've only got 10 or 15 minutes. I don't know how deep I'm going to get into the empiricist. We might have to pick up next time. I was hoping next time would be devoted almost entirely to Sartre, but it looks like we might have just a little bit of modern philosophy to wrap up on Tuesday. Not much, though. So you get to the empiricists, and you've got them asking much very similar questions to the rationalists, but they're taking a much different tact at answering these questions. So let's go back again to our original slide, the one where the guy's staring at the tree. So the rationalists try to resolve this problem. You know, how do I know my experience and my thoughts of the object are true and actually conform to reality? We saw their basic approach. Well, you try to extract from the senses anything. For Descartes, it's anything mathematical, quantitative, measurable, and that's what we can know objectively. That doesn't depend on me. That depends on the nature of geometry, mathematics, and we can analyze space in those terms. And that's how I get to the true nature of the sun and its true dimensions and what it really is, not how it appears to me. So we stick with math, we stick with reason. And so we kind of ignore our initial sort of, this little picture we have in our head, and we try to analyze it mathematically. And if you're like Leibniz, you start getting down to like things like, what is treeness itself? What is, shape or squareness itself, and circularity itself, and triangularity itself. And then ultimately you break things down to their essence and you get to the monads, you get to the ultimate things, the abstract principles that by which the universe is guided and organized. And the empiricists are going to be like, what are you talking about? What the heck is monad? Especially when you get to Hume. He's really going to be against this. Berkeley, too. I've got Berkeley's name up here. We'll talk a little bit about Berkeley. But, John Locke is the first name I'll have on the list. I'll get back to the list in a minute. But they're basically all going to have a similar answer, whether it's Locke, Berkeley, or Hume. And there's more empiricists than these three. These are the three most influential ones. These are the three big names. That's why I picked them. But in a sense, they approach this problem. They have a kind of a different answer, each of them, but they kind of get rid of this out there. They're like, look, I don't know what the thing in itself is. All I have is my experience of the thing. I'm never going to get to the tree itself outside of my view. No, I just have my view. You can't step outside of your own mind. But let's look at our mind, and we can look at our experience as an empiricist, because that's for them the basis of knowledge, is analyzing our experience. And we can look at our experience, and we can look at things that seem to depend. This is Locke, who kind of takes this tack. We can look at things in our experience that depend on ourself, our condition, how we feel, and things that don't seem to depend on our condition and ourself and how we feel. And then we can arrive at some notion of objectivity, some notion of what a thing is that is reliable. We'll never get to the thing in itself, John Locke thought. We'll never know what the thing in itself is. He believed it exists. He thought, just like Descartes, there must be something out there. It's not just in my head. There must be an object that's causing me to see it. You know, when I look at the desk, I'm not making myself see a desk. It's there, and I'm going to see it whether I will to or not. So Locke believes in the thing in itself, to use the philosophical term, thing in itself. But he says it's something I know not what. Something I know not what. Je ne sais quoi, right? I have no idea, and I'll never know, and I can't know. All I have is up here in my experience. And so let's deal with that. What we can do is we can break down our experience into what he called the primary versus the secondary qualities of things. So when I look at a certain object like the tree or this desk, Locke is going to say there are certain qualities that the desk has or the tree has that are primary, where others are secondary. What distinguishes the two? Well, he gives us a list of what he calls primary and a list of secondary. And like, for instance, he would say that the density or the shape of the desk, the density, the shape of the tree are primary, whereas the taste or the smell of those objects, I don't know, and I don't want to. I don't want to find out what my desk or that tree tastes like. But he would say like the smell or whatever, those things would be secondary qualities. And I kind of hinted at it earlier. The real distinction for Locke is that the primary qualities are not dependent upon the state that I'm in. For instance, if I'm sick or my vision is kind of blurry, or maybe my nose is like stopped up because I'm sick and I can't smell that well, and I have the flu, so my sense of taste is not that great. The shape of the object is not going to change. So even if I'm in a bad mood or pissed off, or like, the desk is still going to be the same shape. The color of it, though, he says, is secondary, because let's say I take this desk, it's a black desk, but let's just imagine I'm using a white desk. If I take a white desk, like this drafting table I have here next to me, that's a white. If I take that one and I put it in a dark room and I shine a red light on the desk, the color of the desk will appear to be red. But I know that's because of the lighting, that's because of the conditions, maybe because of the where I'm standing at. So secondary qualities depend on the conditions, on my condition, on my perspective, where I'm standing, that sort of thing. Whereas the primary qualities don't, right? The shape, the tree is the same shape, the desk is the same shape, no matter, what state I'm in. So that's his distinction. Now we get to Berkeley. And Berkeley is, to me, and when I say interesting, I like the guy, and I'm not trying to demean him, but like, he's unique amongst philosophers, but also amongst the empiricists, because this guy's not just an empiricist, George Berkeley, but he's also what you would call an idealist, and that makes him unique. And I'll explain what an idealist is here in a minute. But he's also a very religious man. Both Locke and Hume, they seem to be kind of secular guys. They professed that they were religious, but it didn't really. It kind of seemed like they were going through the motions, especially David Hume. I mean, that guy. In fact, that was part of the reason he didn't really, I think, make it as a philosopher. He was branded an atheist and a skeptic, and today that would be no big deal. But back in the 1700s, that was it for your career. You wouldn't get hired as a philosopher if you were an atheist. Now it's like, you can't imagine that. It's like, I think they did a survey about 10 years ago, and like something like 90% of philosophy professors are agnostic or atheist or something. But that's not how it was back then. But Berkeley was very religious. He was a bishop, and Berkeley was, so a man of the cloth. But he was an empiricist, and that was kind of unique. Most of the deeply religious, devout thinkers were rationalists. But Berkeley was an empiricist. He thought that what it meant to exist or to have any sort of being was to be perceived. All that exists was perceptible. When you say that something is, that something has existence, that it's true, what you mean is you perceive it, that you experience it. And so his solution to this is completely unique. And this is the idealism part. This is what makes him an idealist. Berkeley thinks that the thing in itself is not some object out there. Berkeley doesn't think there is an out there. All there is what I'm experiencing. To be is to be perceived. Et si est percepi. That's what that Latin phrase I have up on the screen says. To be is to be perceived. So if you remember, Descartes thought there's no way that could be what's happening. That would be very deceptive. He argued that that's the reason we have to believe in external objects, because if there are no external objects, but we're compelled to believe there are, we all think, who doesn't believe? I mean, maybe somebody here doesn't. You started reading all this philosophy, now you're like, maybe it is all in my mind. But I'm assuming most of us, I do, I think the physical world exists out there. I don't think it's all just in my head. Descartes argues that we all think this, we're all compelled to believe this. Why would God make us think that that's the case if it really isn't? That would be deceptive, so therefore that can't be the case. There must actually be physical objects that exist. And so, but Berkeley finds no problem with this. Berkeley's like, no, actually, we aren't compelled to believe that. You fooled yourself into thinking that. It's actually more commonsensical to once you think about it, what you mean when you say that something is that you can see it. When I say that this bottle of water exists, it's because I'm perceiving this bottle of water. And so that's why Berkeley rejects some of the rationalists who, like Leibniz. Leibniz is very insistent that if you can picture it in your head, if you can imagine it, it's not true. It's not the thing in itself. So you can't picture a triangle. You have to analyze its properties abstractly. You have to think about the property of triangularity, the property of circularity. And Berkeley's like, there's no such thing. That's just, you have to have content. You have to think of a triangle. All thoughts have some perceptual content, Berkeley insists. So when you say something is, you literally mean it's something perceptible. And what does the perceiving? A mind. Ultimately, a mind is what does the perceiving. That's why he's an idealist. To exist is to be perceived, and to perceive is to have a mind. All perception is through the mind. That's his form of idealism. And so there is no object out there. The thing in itself is the experience. But then the question comes up. Does that mean that if I don't perceive something, and if nobody else perceives something, that thing no longer exists? So when I leave my home every day, well, I guess my cat is here to perceive it, but heck, if I leave my office, I've got this office full of books and a bunch of other crap I need to organize, I'm way past due organizing it. Are you telling me that when I walk out of this room and I take a right and go down the stairs, that everything behind me disappears because it's no longer being perceived? I go to the grocery store and I run into Professor Berkeley, and I tell him, hey, Berkeley, I guess my room doesn't exist anymore. Well, Berkeley could tell me, no, Travis, you're thinking about your room. You're perceiving it right now in your mind as you're telling me about it. But that's kind of stupid. That's kind of absurd. Am I thinking about every book on my bookshelf? Am I thinking about every crack on the ceiling? I mean, what the heck? Are you kidding me? But Berkeley has a solution for this. Remember, Berkeley is a very religious man. So Berkeley says, God perceives all things at all times. He's the ultimate perceiver. So therefore, yes, your room still does exist. There's an old Buddhist mystery koan is what they call it, a sort of question that's supposed to make you contemplate and meditate. And it's, if there's a tree that's falling in the woods and there's no one there to hear it, does it make a sound? Berkeley would say, of course it makes a sound. God heard it. God hears everything. Now, how does Berkeley prove God's existence? It seems like his philosophy hinges a lot on God. Otherwise, everything's going to disappear if someone's not looking at it. I guess we have to start taking shifts on keeping certain things in existence or something. Could somebody think about my office? Just take a good look at it, keep that in your mind, and I don't want it to disappear. Think about it for me between 2 and 3 today or something. God is kind of important to Berkeley. Does he have an argument for God? Well, yes. I don't know if it's the strongest one, but he basically uses an old argument. You can go back, you could argue it's a different version of an old argument going back to Aristotle, St. Thomas. It's sort of like, well, there has to be a cause for all of my experiences. There has to be something causing it, and I can't be the cause. That wouldn't explain it. I'm not enough to explain my experience. I didn't decide to do all the things. I didn't program my life. So that wouldn't be sufficient. That wouldn't be a sufficient reason to explain everything that is. And so Berkeley argues ultimately the only thing that it could explain my experience would be that God created it. That's the only being that is sufficient enough to create all that is. And we'll talk, because we're running out of time, so we'll talk about some of David Hume's arguments against that way of thinking. David Hume, we'll talk about him a little bit next class. We'll get to Hume, Kant, and I guess by the end of class, we're going to somehow, in the next lecture, segue from theories of knowledge, epistemology, to theories of action and value, ethics, and through Hume and Kant we'll do this. But essentially, Berkeley thinks that he has more certainty of God's existence than he even does of his own perceptions, which sounds kind of like, what? So you're more sure that God exists than what you're perceiving exists? That seems kind of counterintuitive. Who would deny their own perceptions? Maybe you'd say, like Descartes, it's all a dream. But you're having the dream, you're having perceptions, you can't doubt that. But Berkeley's like, no, even that might be unreal, but I could never doubt God's existence because that's the only thing that could explain my perceptions. That's the only thing that could explain having perceptions. And I obviously have perceptions, so God must be there. Well, Hume has a bit of a argument against that. Wait a minute, is that the only thing they can explain your perceptions? I have other possible explanations. You might not like them, but I have other possibilities. I don't think we can answer that question. I don't think we could ever know why all this is. It just is. Here we are. We exist. But knowing the origin of it, Hume would argue that's beyond human understanding. That's beyond philosophers. The human mind just can't know that. And Kant kind of agrees. Kind of agrees with Hume. But remember, Kant's not an empiricist, so that's a much more complicated story. We're going to have to leave for another day. And that day, I guess, will be Tuesday at 11 a.m. If you can make it, that would be great. If not, you'll see the replay. I'll post it as soon as I can on YouTube. But we're moving on to Sartre pretty quickly. I don't have a whole lot more to say about the empiricist and the rationalist. And then, we'll get through Kant. And Kant was super influential when it comes to ethics. And I think Sartre, the next philosopher, is partly responding to Kant and other ethics. So the segue won't be quite as convoluted as it sounds from theories of knowledge, epistemology, and ethics. So I'm going to stop right now because this is a good place to stop. And I'll stop recording. If you guys want to stick around for questions, I'll be here.